motion for this round reads, this House opposes the development of lethal autonomous weapons. Debating this round are Team Italy, who are opposing, as well as Team USA, who are opposing. Hungary. Okay, and the adjudicators for this round are Alejo Gonzalez Vergili from Argentina, Jason Palmer from Greece, and Carl Martin Kierberg from Estonia. Each speaker has 8 minutes to deliver their speech. The end of the speech will be marked by a double knock. The first and the 7th minute are protected from points of information and will be marked by 1 knock. The first or the second speaker of each side will deliver a 4-minute reply speech for their side. There are no points of information during reply speeches. And I now invite the first speaker for side proposition.
If the government and the people of the world have a word to speak for the salvation of the world, now is the time, and now is the last time when words will be of any use. For it is wrong in its direct effect, and it is wrong in its prospective principle to allow lethal autonomous weapons, from now on referred on our side as killer robots, to be developed. Let me elaborate. First of all, our definitions. We define autonomous as robots that search, find, and execute a target on its own. Essentially a robot or a drone that is pre-programmed to make decisions instead of human controlling it. Lethal is something that is used to attack and kill, and we must ban development and not just regulate. I will demonstrate why in 3 layers of analysis. First of all, if one country has it, all other nations must develop it too, for national security reasons, to limit the possibilities of a single nation having a monopoly on this technology. Therefore, it is necessary that no nation develops this technology so that an arms race doesn't break out. And B, the fundamental technologies behind killer robots is computational power and code, which is an intangible thing. Therefore, it is easier to replicate these, and therefore it is necessary that no nations develop this technology whatsoever. And C, why solve a problem when you can prevent it? Less money and effort to control it. If you less money and effort to control something that hasn't even been developed yet in the first place. Let me introduce the model we'll be working with today. Firstly, I will show you 3 precedents that have already taken place where such bans have worked. The 1983 Convention on Conventional Weapons, the 1995 Protocol on Blinding Lasers, and the 2004 United Nations Security Council Resolution 1540 on weapons of mass destruction. These bans, yes?
In these kinds of situations, we think it's far more likely that a robot will follow things like the laws of war because that can be programmed. The same guarantee does not exist for humans.
I'm not sure I exactly understand how that point comes here, but we'll actually get to robots following the rules of war in my first argument, which they cannot do, and I will demonstrate that. So, first of all, these bans work. Since 2004, no new nuclear nation has arisen. The same bans would work. So, why should we can, as articulated in Article 41, 42, and 43, economic sanctions and military intervention is possible if a nation would break this ban on these weapons, and therefore this is possible to ban it. But let me show why we should ban it. By first, let me elaborate our burdens today. We must prove that killer robots violate international law, which they do, and we must also prove that the costs of killer robots outweigh the benefits in the long run. Now, why the long run, you might ask? It's because the global politics, the foundation of global politics is on long-term, I will take you in a moment, is on long-term responsible decision-making. Just like fighting climate change instead of quick industrial development and seeking peace between the 2 Koreas. In the world of global politics, we must focus on long-term responsible decisions. Yes?
Sure. In the long term, wouldn't it be preferable to have a world where we don't have to use human lives to be able to prove a point within war?
Well, that is what this debate is about, and that is what we will demonstrate, that even in the long term, the harms outweigh the benefits. Now let me get to the argumentative structure. I will be focusing on the first argument called humaneness, incongruity with international law. And I will also elaborate on the second argument titled distance, easier to kill from afar. While Peter, our second speaker, will elaborate on our third argument, no thank you, which is called future, lowering the barriers of war. Now let me get to my first argument. The three cornerstones of international law shall become the three layers of analysis for this argument: proportionality, military necessity, and distinction. Even if only one of these layers it holds up argumentation, any and all use of killer robots is illegal and a crime against humanity. Now first, let me get to proportionality. No, thank you. The international humanitarian law prohibits disproportionate acts in which civilian harm outweighs military benefits. These concepts are abstract, not easily quantified, no thank you, and highly relative to specific contexts of subjective estimates of value. Humans are better suited to make such value judgments, which cannot be boiled down to a simple algorithm. Military necessity dictates that military force should only be used against the enemy to the extent necessary for winning the war. Imagine a scenario where a killer robot has already shot a person once. How would they know that it is necessary to shoot them again? For safety reasons, it might shoot them again when it's not necessarily humiliating the dead body. Now this will have impacts I will get to later, no thank you. But first let me get to distinction, the bedrock principle of international humanitarian law. It says that the Geneva Convention states that combatants must distinguish between the civilian population and combatants. No, thank you. Attacks that fail to distinguish are indiscriminate and unlawful. It is as simple as that. Fully autonomous weapons will not have the ability to sense or interpret the difference between soldiers and civilians, especially in contemporary combat environments. Asymmetric conflicts in urban populations has become the norm, with often no true distinction in uniform or insignia. Firstly, insurgents could trick these robots by concealing their weapons, but most importantly, humans understand one another in a way that machines cannot. Cues can be subtle, and there are an infinite number of circumstances where lethal force is inappropriate. For example, imagine a frightened mother may run after her two children and yell at them to stop playing with toy guns near a soldier. A human soldier could easily identify with the mother's fear and the children's gain, and thus recognize the intention as harmless, while a fully autonomous weapon might only see an angry person running toward it with two armed individuals. Now the first level of impact is that this would break international law, but even more importantly, that innocent men, women and children would be killed unnecessarily. And a third level of impact would be that it is shown that if civilians are killed or even humiliated, then there will be greater retribution, greater resistance movements, and thus prolonged conflict. Now let me get to my second argument, which is called future, which is called distance, easier to kill from afar. Now the main value in war, as in most things, is responsibility, but this is especially important in war, where the stakes are so high. If someone does something bad, they must be punished, and their mistake must be corrected. Now, not being physically close to a person you're harming makes it much easier to do harm. The Milgram experiment in the 1960s showed that people are willing to incur surprising levels of harm on others if they are separated by them and ordered by an authority figure. Programming killer robots is also rather impersonal. You work with criteria, algorithm, and lines of code, but that have the same impact as pulling the trigger. Now, first of all, programmers this way will not experience PTSD, which otherwise would force people to think twice. Furthermore, just like in video games where you can die repeatedly, you can act irresponsibly without fearing the consequences. A programmer might be reprimanded, but they're not going to feel the guilt of 10 years prison or the guilt of having killed 2 innocent lives. Now, the impact of this argument is that it breaks the UN Chapter 7 and the Geneva Convention because it causes unnecessary harm on these people, which is especially important because while we may never stop warfare, we can make it more humane. And that is what we stand for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This speech lasted 8 minutes and 10 seconds. I would like to thank the first. I would like to thank the first speaker of the proposition for their speech, and would like to invite the first speaker of the opposition to deliver their speech.
During the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, a group of Soviet soldiers brutally murdered 350 women and children. They slit the throats of the children, disemboweled pregnant women, shooting and mutilating the others. There are thousands of history of humans committing the gravest atrocities in warfare, violating every single human rights standard they say is so important on their side of the house. Because we acknowledge the inherent limited capacity of humans in both providing security and strict adherence to moral standards, we are happy to support a technology that does both in ways that humans simply cannot or very proud to oppose. Before I introduce some responses to the proposition's material and introduce our first two arguments, I'd just like to clarify some things in this round. On proposition, they have to oppose development of all lethal autonomous weapons. We defend their use, not necessarily in every single instance, but rather support development in ways consistent with international law and human rights, which we recognize are very important. This looks like three things. First, extensive testing of this technology to ensure that it can do things like distinguish between a mother and a combatant on the battlefield. But second, in muddled situations where we don't trust this technology's ability to, say, differentiate civilians from combatants, we simply would not deploy it. Just as we don't support the use of, say, drones or guns in every single instance, we can be selective about our use of LAWs as well. Third and finally, we would have officials monitor technology and shut it off should these things essentially start acting out of the interest of the country. This technology would still operate and fire independently, but should it start doing so outside of strategic interest, people would still be able to shut it down. And we would hold officials accountable if they, say, knowingly allow mass atrocities to happen. What does this mean? It means that all of their argumentation about robots being completely incapable of judging these sorts of things fall, because we would extensively test this technology to the point where it is able to do this and would not deploy this technology if it failed to do so. With that, let's introduce some rebuttal to all of their case. Before, they had two main arguments about humaneness and increasing distance, but they also had this one-off line about increasing arms races. We think this is true of all military technology, not unique to LAWs and not really important in this round. Well, let's talk about their first argument about improving humaneness. Let's just point out, we have a number of responses. First, that humans have violated literally every single one of these standards. They say that if LAWs violate even one of these standards, we do not deploy them. This is just kind of an inevitable consequence, and we think is actually more likely in a world where humans are engaging in this warfare. That's the comparative. Second, we already talked about our model. If it is inconsistent with any of these ideas, we wouldn't deploy it. But third and finally, let's just talk about what humans do on the battlefield, right? When you're under fire and are under super stressful conditions where you're having to make split-second decisions about whom to kill and whom not to kill when you're fearing for your life, you're very unlikely to be able to think in split seconds about proportionality and military necessity and distinguishing between civilians. We think that LAWs, because they just are technologically superior, are able to account for all of this much better and actually adhere to the laws of war far better. We'll explain more about this in our first argument. On to their second argument, they told you that by increasing distance, we increase violence. This was kind of a bit assertive, and we think actually the opposite is true. That when we have programmers deciding about the parameters under which LAWs are going to operate, they're much more likely to be more conservative and avoid things like civilian casualties and the like, decreasing the irrational decision-making on the battlefield that we think is so problematic. But our second response to this is basically their argument is that we need soldiers to feel ridiculously traumatized after they kill someone in order to reduce their ability to do so. We don't really think that that is principally justified. We don't think that subjecting millions of people to mass amounts of PTSD is a legitimate way to reduce conflict. There are other ways to do it that our side does better. With that, let's introduce our first argument about how LAWs reduce wartime atrocities. Two ideas under this. The first is that they prevent human atrocities because they don't have human fallibilities. Again, the comparative here is humans, who are worse for two reasons. First is fear. In life and death situations, when there are bullets and bombs whizzing by your head, there is overwhelming incentives to act irrationally. This leads to soldiers doing things like flinching and shooting a civilian, and projecting that fear into other situations. One of the main reasons that sexual assault is so high in conflict zones is because soldiers attempt to regain power and control after feeling helpless and terrified in violent war zones. The second problem with humans is with retributive rage. Governments use nationalism to motivate soldiers to demonize the enemy, to get them to do all of the horrible things that are necessary for soldiers to do in war. This explains how soldiers come to see eventually their enemies as effectively non-human, leading them to commit some of the worst atrocities in warfare. This looks like the atrocious torture that happened in the Abu Ghraib prison during human engagements in the Middle East. Go.
Could bad governments not use this technology to kill civilians the same way they do now?
We think that bad governments are going to exist on both sides of the house, and they're going to use the same dehumanizing tactics for their soldiers to get them to commit these atrocities and worse. We think it is incredibly unlikely that a cool-headed room of programmers, military officials, and civilian leaders who all have to buy in to the kind of programming that LAWs have to have in order to be built are going to do things like program robots to rape or torture civilians, which are incredibly unstrategic things to do. All of this buy-in limits the possibility of that happening. In contrast, when one terrified soldier on the opposite side of their home country, who literally does not think that a Vietnamese woman is human, decides to rape that Vietnamese woman, all it takes is buy-in from that one terrified soldier. That is much less likely in a world where we have to have all of this accountability before deploying LAWs. Let's get to the second idea under this argument, that we record and report atrocities that happen when human members of the military would otherwise stay silent. Platoons of soldiers are often incredibly intensely loyal to one another. They're in conflict zones together, and they really don't want to inform on one another, even when they do horrific, atrocious things. We think this is less likely in a world where LAWs are directly monitoring the situation. We'd even be happy to send this footage directly to civilian leaders to ensure that accountability happens. But our second argument is that LAWs enable militaries to better protect all people. Two ideas under this. The first is that they increase defensive capacities. Remember that this debate is not just about offensive military robots, it's also about defensive things, like, say, the US's phalanx system, which is an LAW that automatically shoots down missiles without any kind of human intervention, and does so way more effectively because of technological limitations surrounding humans than they possibly can. These defensive mechanisms are really important because we think it's government's obligation to defend their soldiers in a way that human operators technologically can't. They have an obligation to protect the citizens who pay taxes to them, follow their laws, fight and die for them, and we think improving defensive capacities in addition to offensive ones is very important. Our second idea under this argument is that we improve choices about when to use offensive capacities. Intervention without LAWs is worse because we fail to intervene in humanitarian cases because there are political risks from soldier casualties. There are already plenty of incentives to go to war for geopolitical reasons or things like resource extraction, and we already see governments doing that on their side in the status quo. What we don't see governments doing is intervening in things like genocide in other countries that don't pose a direct threat to their own security and means you're in protected time and means that it's really hard to justify politically for soldiers to intervene. This looks like things like missions, the US not deploying troops to Rwanda, where there's a horrific genocide happening because they feared political backlash, akin to political backlash that happened in the 90s when a humanitarian mission was shot down in Somalia. We do not have these risks on our side of the house, saving millions of people like Tutsi minorities that were massacred during these genocides. We're very proud to oppose.
would like to thank the first speaker of the opposition for their speech, and I would like to invite
I would like to thank the first speaker of the opposition for their speech, and would like to invite the second speaker of the proposition to deliver their speech.
Generations were devastated after the Second and First World War because actually people were deprived of their own humanity, and then they had to act as machines in a global warfare. That's what we want to prevent on our side of the house. First of all, what we'll do is move into some model rebuttal, and then reconstruct our case a little bit and move on to rebuttal on what we heard on their side of the house, and lastly move on to what our last argument, actually lowering the barriers of war, and how with these killer robots we'd actually have more warfare, and this warfare would be disproportionately affecting developing nations. So first of all, what did we hear from their side of the house? Basically they came up here and tell us that actually they will only deploy these killer robots means that extensive testing, and that we can be 100% sure, and actually we will just shut them down if they do something bad. First of all, they hugely mischaracterize the whole case. Basically, what we know about killer robots that they can search, find, and execute, right? So they are basically thinking on their own, acting on their own, meaning that they can not only just develop their own language and act based on their own. The people who are actually like over them we lose actually in the end a certain kind of control over these robots, right? So we tell you that this is only an ideal world when this can actually happen. And if team opposition tries to make this case, they're actually conceding from their burden, where we are actually arguing about lethal autonomous weapons, which are actually 100% AI, who can actually think, do stuff for themselves, and actually harm citizens on their own and think on their own. Thank you. So what did we hear as a rebuttal from them? So basically we had this first argument about how we have right now 3 pillars of international law in the current international framework about proportionality, necessity, and distinction, and they just disregarded our whole argument and they said that no, these will actually be better because we'll have killer robots which will be 100% sure and doing everything what we do. But ladies and gentlemen, the main issue is that even if we have like those very good killer robots, we are telling you that they cannot really they cannot fit into the current international model of law, right? So we tell you that there's proportionality, that there will be actually certain cases where these robots won't be able to determine that when to actually, to actually shoot someone or not shoot someone. Is it actually needed to win that certain war, or is it not needed? And we tell you that it's very hard to distinction in these cases where we don't have this, right? And lastly, our first speaker already told you that we see that the main issue here is not only that this does not fit into the current international law, and we need to reform that before, but also that we will lose a certain kind of responsibility because we don't know who was the person who actually didn't make the distinction before that combatant or that soldier, right? We won't know that who will be the one who actually harmed citizens unnecessarily because there will be only programmers sitting behind the screen. No, thank you. So this is how they mischaracterize our whole case. Moving on to what we had as our second argument, is that we have this distance, and how is it easier for programmers to actually just make a code which will in the end kill these people and not think about any human consequences, and how different is it when a human is there and they are seeing blood, they are seeing bullets, and they are seeing all these horrors of war there in the front of their eyes, and they are ignoring all these human elements and human decision making, and they are characterizing humans as savages basically, who just go out and because there were certain atrocities in certain wars, and therefore they characterize as humans. I will take you as savages all over. Yes.
We do not characterize human beings in wars as savages, but rather as human beings. They're going to be scared because bullets are flying past them and their friends are dying.
Yes,
thus
thank you
making
very much. That's
irrational
what we are talking about, that these people will be actually scared, that they will be scared about starting a new war. And that's what we wanted to move on to our second rebuttal, that what we see is that generally war now is not supported, right? Because people don't like it when people go home and see that their grandfather or their brother were actually shot, or there's someone who is suffering of PTSD. That actually has an effect on people, right? We see that, we saw in the Vietnam War that people were protesting because they all knew someone who was actually harmed in the war, so they went out and told you that, no, please, US government, we should stop this, right? So this is all what we see in our side, that this is actual harm, and team opposition is trying to mischaracterize humans as just savages who will, when they go out to the war can they just actually do more harm because they are actually very scared. So we don't see on this case at all. So moving on to the second argument, which was about these human issues and loyalty and humanitarian. We are telling you that even that on our side of the house, on their side of the house, there will be even more harm, because with these killer robots there will be no loyalty, there will be no certain kind of, I don't know, there will be no killer robots actually better identifying if this is a humanitarian case or if this is not, right? Because we saw in the Kosovo war that there were actually cases where these were misguised as something else, right? So they actually, humanitarian aid didn't get into the country anyway, so we don't see how there would be additional harm on our side. So moving on to our last argument, which is about lowering the barriers of war, and which clashes directly with their argument, because even if we take them on their high stance and tell that, yeah, there will be actually killer robots which will be 100% sure, and every single time they will execute exactly how we tell them, which we already told you is not the case, but even if that's true, we'll tell you why there will be even more harm on their side. So what do we see? I will give you 3 levels of analysis on lowering the barriers of war. So we'll tell you, why is it easier to start a war when there's actually these killer robots in place? Why there will be civilians disproportionately suffering after this motion is in place? And why there will be a bigger backlash on, especially on developing nations. So what we'll see is that right now in the status quo, actually their states are not starting wars because they see the human casualty, right? We saw that in the Second World War, in the Vietnam War, any war, that people will, states will first think about how many humans can they actually kind of sacrifice for this cause, right? So if we won't have these casualties, then it will be much easier for states to just start a war, right? Because there won't be anything to think about. In the Vietnam War, as I already told you, people were protesting because their brothers were dying. So we tell you that if there's not such an issue for a country, then it will be much easier for them to start the war, and they will actually. So what we are telling you is that there will be civilians actually bearing the consequences, right? Because we tell you that war is bad in itself, even if it's fought with robots, even if no, so to speak, combatants or no, so to speak, civilians are dying. Why? Because there will be devastation in the area where the war is happening, right? Infrastructure will be damaged, no shipping will get into the certain area, businesses will go out of operation as a result, people won't be able to have access to water, food, or anything, the environment will be damaged for years, the shells will need to be collected, and landmines will be all over the place. So we are telling you that even if in the long term, we see that these areas where wars were happening, even with robots, civilians will actually bear the backlash, because they will be the ones suffering. Lastly, developing countries will bear the backlash. Developing countries will be the ones bearing the backlash, because countries who are rich won't be fighting on their own lands, right? They will just go out for proxy war, for example, to Syria, and have their own robots fight there, because it's much easier, and their infrastructure and their own civilian population won't be harmed. That's why it's much easier for the US to start wars in the Middle East, because there's no harm on their side, and that's why Europe was devastated after 2 world wars, because it actually happened on their land. So because on our side they're arguing for a more humane warfare, we are so proud to propose that.
So this speech lasted 8 minutes and 24 seconds. thank the second speaker of the proposition for their speech and would like to invite the second speaker of the opposition to deliver their
We think in their last speech, they gave us a lot of reasons why they think there is a problem with war. They never once engaged with what the actual comparative is in this debate. Are humans better at decision making? Note, this was not reliant on us saying that humans are savages, or for example, a 19-year-old kid who has been transported to a different country that now has to hold a gun is simply inherently evil. In our first speech, we said that humans have legitimate and natural feelings of fear, anger, and self-preservation that will always triumph over their ideas of ethical, complex decision making. We think at the end of the day, I hear a lot of mechanistic quibbles about international law and quote-unquote killer robots that only are used offensively for massive destruction. This is not what the debate is about. We think they have completely missed what the heart of this round ought to be about. We think we're already ahead. In this speech, I'm first going to be engaging with all of the material that we've heard so far, coming out of the proposition, before secondly delivering our third substantive argument that analyzes the human cost of going to war. But now let's get into this first idea. They talk about how lethal autonomous weapons violate international law. We have a number of responses. First off, note that in their last speech, they never once engaged with it. Ella tells you and makes very clear in her first speech that actually having lethal autonomous weapons decreases conflict overall. Why is this the case? We talked to you about the idea that lethal autonomous weapons can be used in specific instances and more surgically to actually have better identification of what actual targets are. For example, if we think a soldier comparatively is on the battlefield and they see someone approaching them, they're much more likely to actually depend on things like fear, anger, and self-preservation to act retributively instead of actually defensively. We think that on our side of the house, we actually help civilians more. But the second thing that we told you underneath this pragmatic point is that weapons will still be tested before they're deployed, meaning that we can actually test to ensure that a robot can distinguish, for example, between a farmer holding a pitchfork or a rebel holding an AK-47, or a child holding a rock and a militant holding a grenade before deploying it. We think that all of the mechanistic quibbles they have are just that, and we don't think that's the actual comparative in the debate. But now, let's really get into this issue about violating international law. We think that first, similarly to any time international law is violated in war, accountability can still exist for lethal autonomous weapons. Note, the proposition never gives us a reason for why lethal autonomous weapons would not be held liable to the same international law. In our highest ground, we first tell you the idea that lethal autonomous weapons are less likely to commit these kinds of crimes, but if they were, and we assume that in some cases lethal autonomous weapons might malfunction, we still think we can hold two actors accountable that in and of themselves prevent these kind of crimes from occurring in the first place. The first actor that we would be happy to hold accountable is a programmer who caused a lethal autonomous weapon to perform an operation that violates international law. Similar to how one can track individual edits on a Google Doc, programmers can individually be held liable. We think that for that specific code they contribute. The second is a war general who chooses to deploy an LAW. I think we already talked about this enough in our model in our first speech, and we think that generals have an incentive to be selective in deploying LAWs, meaning they're less likely to put them in situations that warrant these kinds of international law breaking in the first place. But let's really engage with the comparative. If a human soldier breaks international law, what did we tell you in our first speech? For example, with the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, where US soldiers murdered and raped 500 men, women, and children, even in spite of the fact that they believe that humans are all benevolent actors that are capable of complex decision-making whenever they feel threatened. We think accountability relies entirely on fellow soldiers reporting on their friends. Human loyalty prevents accountability. That was in our first argument. They failed to engage. But now let's compare that to lethal autonomous weapons and prove why we went on this point. We think lethal autonomous weapons create a concrete trail. If you believe their argument is true of accountability, that's a reason to oppose. But now let's engage with their second argument on distance. We don't think PTSD has been a good deterrent. Rather, their argument is at its core that people need to suffer in order to know just how terrible war is. We're going to think, first off, we think that's very legitimate in the case that we think war still happens. And secondly, on this example of the Vietnam War, it did not stop because of protest. We think that rather it continued in spite of the will of the people. But now, engaging with this third argument on this idea of decreasing the threshold for war. First off, we think that the threshold for war is already pretty low. They give us no distinct reasons why lethal autonomous weapons will distinctly actually lead to this impact. But secondly, we think that in some cases, yes, it does happen, but those cases are actually beneficial to the extent that we actually see a conflict, that we actually see intervention be more likely. That actually looks like what we tell you about in our second argument with things like humanitarian intervention. Why is this the case? Because nations that did not have an incentive before to intervene to conflicts that didn't actually threaten their own national security, now are able to do so without putting the lives of their own civilians at risk. For example, in the Rwanda genocide. But we think that on this final argument they give us about developing nations, it has internal tension with their arms race argument. We think that yes, wealthy countries probably will always have an advantage, but if their arms race argument is true, we think that having greater production of lethal autonomous weapons then means that countries that are developing are able to access them even more. But finally, on these two other arguments they give us about the actual machines being unreliable, we think they can be tested in the first place, programming resolves the problems, and on this issue of lethal autonomous weapons being costly, we think comparatively it's less costly to have an entire military training and deployment. If anything, LAWs protect the economy trade-off that governments otherwise have to make with the military while still being able to actually help to preserve the lives of their own soldiers and civilians. But now let's move on to our third substantive argument, which is that it is immoral for governments to rely on human soldiers when there is a viable alternative. Before I go on, I'll take a point of information if you have one. Just a second, please.
Yes, so...
No, go on. So, in such a case when there is a self-learning device, how could you hold a programmer accountable and responsible for
Because
such
we
an act?
think that you can track specific pieces of programming that individuals do. That's why I gave the example of the Google Doc. We think it works in a much similar fashion. But now let's get into our third substantive argument about how it's immoral for governments to deploy humans. We think first off, lethal autonomous weapons limit the situations where governments have to put their citizens at risk of substantial harm in the first place. Obviously, war has massive costs. Sending soldiers into a field with potential landmines is unjust whenever we could be sending an autonomous armed robotic vehicle. Additionally, soldiers that do survive often face massive trauma, such as PTSD, shell shock, or actual anxiety and depression that can last them a lifetime from either having to see their own fellow soldiers die or nearly be threatened to kill themselves. We think that has not, one, deterred war, but secondly, these costs are augmented by the fact that the most vulnerable people are often likeliest to become soldiers. People who face extreme adversity in their lives and often have less to lose by going into the military or have no other option for financial reasons or because a court has given them the option of military or jail, often choose to join the military. We think militaries around the world deliberately attract high school age teens. For example, in Britain, they've had a deliberate campaign to attract teens from low-income communities. The wealthy often can avoid military service entirely, such as whenever the Peruvian government reinstated the draft in 2013 that allowed for a $715 fine to skip military service. Given that a person's life is their most central right as a person, because it's a precondition to all other rights, it should only be sacrificed whenever it's absolutely necessary. We think lethal autonomous weapons eliminate the need to actually sacrifice them in the first place. But the second point we have underneath this argument is that lethal autonomous weapons mean governments are less likely to engage in the two comparatives that we give you that are often immoral to find soldiers. The first of this is blatant coercion in the form of a draft. We think conscription violates both the autonomy that states endow citizens and access to well-being by placing soldiers in dangerous situations. But the second is subtle coercion, including recruiting heavily from vulnerable communities, but it also means engaging in misleading nationalism and actual misinformation campaigns. We think this unduly coerces individuals into fighting, depriving them of the ability to make rational and informed decisions. Because LAWs protect the lives of the most disenfranchised citizens the governments view as disposable in war, we oppose.
Thank you. This speech lasted 8 minutes and 30 seconds. like to thank the second speaker of the opposition for their speech and would like to invite the third speaker of proposition to deliver their speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to start my speech with a really short introduction about the technicalities about this motion we are debating today and false assumptions made by side opposition that actually harms this debate today. So first of all, what they said just in the first speech, in the developing stage, is that they are going to monitor technology, they are monitoring these weapons and these lethal autonomous weapons so humans can shut it down. I would like to really shortly say, as the motion said, that's all you can read in this room, that a clarification with the motion was these weapons operate without human intervention. This means the humans are out of the loop and not on the loop, as the side opposition has presented it. So this means that no, humans cannot even shut these weapons down. We let these weapons out on the street and they can decide what to kill and they can decide what they want without any human interaction or shutting down. And second of all, with testing these devices, because it was something that they continuously brought up, and we just want to make a comment on that. No, thank you. No, thank you. I'm going to take it later on. With neural networks and how these systems actually work and how it makes testing actually impossible, because any interaction with this environment means unanticipated interaction with this environment and new data implemented in these self-learning machines. What it means basically in practicality is when we put right data, they can identify right targets. For example, the other enemy's military devices or the soldiers' clothes, they can identify them because of the good data. However, when we test these devices, they can implement wrong data, such as a civilian's clothing. And no, thank you. And the next time what they're going to do is, because we do not have control, because this is how this self-learning artificial intelligence works, they're going to identify the civilians by these testing methods, and they're going to shut those one down. And this is something we cannot prevent, and even the highest professionals within this industry say that this is going to be one of the biggest problems with this AI. So second of all, I would like to go to their arguments and the main clash points of this debate. For example, do not harming humans. Let's take two scenarios in this point. A, what they are saying, there are two possibilities. We let robots out on the street and also a few soldiers and humans. Let's say it is the short-term solution. So what it causes is that there are these weapons that we are not sure we can control, and also these human soldiers, so the brutality will not be solved. The second scenario, scenario B, is that there are no soldiers in the long run, only these robots. So what happens, both countries only use robots and not soldiers, so we can prevent brutality, more and more deaths. Why? I'm going to explain with a short analysis now to you, dear judges. So why? Let's imagine in your work what they're saying, that there are only robots and protecting. This works on the short term, until one side has these robots, no thank you, and can protect their citizens to defense. However, imagine when both sides have these robots, and because we can actually make these robots very fast, because they're not humans and not giving birth, we can reproduce these robots and they simply just be bombed. So what is the next value in our society that we must attack? Civilians, because we cannot reproduce human rights that fast. So the barriers of war and the meaning of war when there are only robots, no thank you, is first of all, yes, we might bomb others' robots. But does it lead war anywhere? No. Is the resources what leads war and what decides war? The societies, the members who pay taxes, who actually go and have the economy, and this is what is going to be at risk by their model. No, thank you, not yet. Now, I would like to move on to the amount of death that I said. First of all, in the short term, that until one side has these weapons, it is okay. However, we, in our case, would not allow even the development, so it is impossible in our case to have even one side of these robots, and this is why we solved the problem at the very beginning. Now, I would like to move to international responsibility, because it was it was also a main question in this debate. So first of all, how can you hold someone responsible for their acts? And we would like to just move to this point very shortly. So why is it really important to hold responsible people in our society? It's because this is how our whole law system and how criminal system works, that there is someone that we can punish and will not commit such a crime. However, in this case, you cannot hold killer robots accountable. They have self-learning machine, self-learning systems, so easily everyone can say, even the businessmen, the programmers, the operators, sorry, it was not my fault because this machine is self-learning. This is what this debate is about. No, thank you. This is what is in the definition. We cannot say that, oh, okay, the full responsibility is theirs, because they just created something that gets self-learning and knows how to self-learn, and we cannot simply prevent that. And this is why we do not want this, because the basic foundations of our society and our criminal and civil law will be harmed by their model. So now I would like to also go to the UN point. No, thank you. The other fundamental part is that no necessary harm should be done in our society, and this in our scenario also works for our side, because we cannot predict yet these AI devices. However, even if we could, let's suppose, this is a false assumption by their side, though, that these are super intelligent testing weapons, even if this is the case, first of all, we cannot, all of these, it's really hard to imagine, but even if we did what I said to you, there is this worst scenario with barriers of war when only robots are fighting. And now I'd like to go to another clash. However, it was unfortunate, not a clash because they did not respond to this all. However, the barriers of war, first of all, as the first speaker of us, Botti has said, it is really important for us to look at global consequences. No, thank you, because such an issue as war, we need to look and take it as an international, as it has its international impact. So now, what is barriers of war? As our second speaker have painted, and this picture, in their scenario, when there are only robots, that when the civil people's lives are taken, the infrastructure is going to be damaged, there is no business, no operation as a result, there will be no one to investing in that area for the long term, job losses, the area has to rebuild, and all these wrong consequences that we would achieve by more and more war. And I believe that our side has told you how this scenario would lead to more and more deaths and more wars. Please.
When it comes to strategy, programmers and war generals have no incentive to deploy LAWs only to kill civilians, especially if international law is such an effective check.
First of all, the first problem with this PRI was that self-learning part that I've already elaborated on, that we do not know exactly how these weapons are going to work. And second of all, yes, programmers might not have this belief. However, what happens in real life is really different what they are trying to say. So what happens is that, first of all, I'm not saying that these weapons are going to attack civilians because they are programmed to. I'm saying that in a word, when robots target each other and kill each other, the only value in war is going to be taking civilian lives, because there are no human soldiers on the battlefield anymore. And it is not going to be the weapons who actually kill them because they are programmed to do so, if we suppose a really positive future. But then the whole scenario of a war will change, because the only mattering will be resources and human lives. And this is what our side proposition would like to prevent. And even what they're saying is that we should not solve this problem because humans have fear, and but they're saying that it is good. We are saying, for their side, we are saying that it is good for our side, because it prevents actually people from killing and more people. And what we have provided to you is that our scenario, when someone is really distant from someone being killed, imagine a video game. You're more likely to kill more people when you're not there on this field, and it's only one click you have to make for that programmer in a room distant. Do not know what these lives are going to take. They're only programmed, okay, it's not going to be bad if I take a few lives away. And with this post-traumatic stress syndrome, what they're even been mentioning, it is not solving the problem, it is hiding the problem. Because yes, people have this stress and they can, but they're not preventing it in their scenario. They're trying to hide it. What we are going to do is we are trying to stop the negative consequences of war at the very beginning and have a more humane war at the end. Thank you very much.
This speech lasted 8 minutes and 17 seconds. I would like to thank the third speaker of the proposition for their speech, and would like to invite the third speaker of the opposition to deliver their speech.
It's hard to believe that an intensely programmed piece of autonomous technology that can siphon through information within a matter of seconds is supposedly a worse actor than, say, a 19-year-old kid drafted into war, holding a gun, watching their friends die beside them, having bullets graze past them because they quote-unquote have compassion, they belong there. We don't think that that's a justifiable response to being able to pull millions of people a year into war scenes because supposedly they're going to act rationally. We think down the bench we've proven that that's not the case, and I'm happy to do even more analysis of that in my speech. But in this speech I'll be doing a few things. The first is I'll be going over one major clarification for today's debate so that we can truly address the true comparative before moving on to discussing two key questions that should summarize it. The first, on which side does what's best for the protection of people. The second, on which side does what's best for the advancements in war. But on to the first thing that we really need to clarify in today's debate. We think that side proposition has given you a complete mischaracterization of what the usage of LAWs truly looks like. What have we heard from their side? LAWs are simply slaughter bots that raise havoc all over areas. They simply kill innocent mothers and children. They want to ultimately harm everybody, and the worst part, they can't be turned off. There's no way to be able to place a check on them. There's no way to hold them accountable. We don't think that this is necessarily what the reasonable ground is in today's debate, insofar that we've given you two very, very rational responses. The first is that when they we think that LAWs are designed to efficiently commit lethal autonomous actions that would have been committed by human beings in the first place, so much so that they're programmed to act in under certain jurisdiction that has already been announced from certain countries. All the laws and regulations that they speak of is something that would be programmed within these lethal autonomous weapons, not something that you can simply program within a human being who is simply trying to save their own life. But secondly, we do think that there's definitely a clear reason as to why we can shut them off. We think it's completely irrational to think that people would create this killer bot that would go out there and cause all these things, but simply wouldn't be able to be turned off. We've given you an extensive model. We don't think that it's enough for them to just assert that you can't turn them off, and that's a full response. But even more so, if you look to the valence system, which we already told you about, they have a button that's able to turn it off if it ultimately acts irrationally, or they'll simply just stop using it and stop deploying it if we see that it's too risky. That's completely fair on our side of the house. Now, on to the first question in today's debate, which is which side does what's best for the protection of people. I think two major central ideas emerged under this point. The first idea is under soldiers. Now, under this point, we gave you a very, very crucial argument that Emily delivered to you very well in her second speech. We told you that when governments are faced with the choice between a piece of technology or hundreds of thousands of soldiers living within their country, they should always have the obligation to choose the viable alternative to ultimately do that. What we heard from side proposition was no response. They completely dropped this third substantive that was very, very crucial to today's debate, especially because soldiers are sometimes the most vulnerable people within society. One, because of drafts. We think that a lot of times deferrals for drafts only go to the privileged in society, keeping them protected. We're the most vulnerable within the nation or have to go out and fight these wars. Furthermore, we think there's a lot of coercion that's involved within these military campaigns. It looks like poor people going to war so that they can escape poverty. That's what their work looks like. Ultimately, we think that the choice for LAWs guarantees two key things. The first is a massive reduction in the amount of casualties. Why is this the case? When LAWs are actively replacing human combatants, that means that there's less human combatants out on the battlefield to die. That's very simple and intuitive here. We think that we're ultimately saving massive amounts of lives. But secondly, we told you that you're actually able to prevent massive amounts of mental disorders for the people that do escape these wars. They often suffer from things like PTSD and shell shock. It speaks volumes to these disorders that only after wars or atrocities were occurred, people discover what these true disorders really were, right? We think that ultimately, when side proposition tells you that you need these in order to stop war, that's not the case. War would have stopped years ago if people truly stopped wars when people got PTSD or when people got depression or anxiety attacks after leaving the war scene. countries will always go to war. We think that that's something that's inevitable. We have to evaluate who's going to be beneficial. But the second central idea that emerged here was based on civilians. Ultimately, we gave you a lot of analysis on why there's discussion about human dissent can be able to stop wars altogether. We told you the Vietnam War did not end because people protested in the streets of America. No, it ended because America lost and wasn't supposed to be there in the first place. Secondly, we think that all the atrocities of rape and violence are unique to human beings being in the battlefield because of the 3 key reasons that we've told you down the bench, but I'm going to get into that further in the next question. Lastly, we got this new argument in the third speech talking about how civilians will simply become the new target because there's less because there's less humans like soldiers in the first place. 3 key responses. Firstly, we think that human soldiers don't completely disappear in our world. We think they just substantially decrease, meaning that there's still going to be engagement with human beings. Secondly, we think that the target is not going to become civilians ever because LAWs are programmed to act under international law, where international law distinctly says that civilians will never be the target. Furthermore, if we truly want to talk about saving civilian lives in wars, pull humans out. Humans constantly target civilians in wars. We've seen it in the Syrian war right now. We've seen it in the Vietnam War, which they would like to talk about. We've seen it in the Korean War. It's always been a target. We think that humans distinctly don't have a problem with doing it because they always see them as the enemy. But now, before I get into the second question, I'll take a question.
If there will be no humans actually involved in war, don't you think that it will be easier for states to start a war?
We don't think that the necessary argument about people not going to war is really a reason as to why there will be a decrease in the amount of war. Ultimately, people go to war regardless of whatever the thing is going to be that's holding them back. We don't think that human cost is the true reason that holds people back from going to war. That's why there's still massive amounts of war on the day-to-day basis. But the second question in today's debate is which side does what's best for the advancements in war. Intuitively, we think efficiency within war reduces 3 key things. The first is the amount of time that you spend in war. The second is the amount of lives that you lose in war. And lastly, the destruction to the regions caused by the war, right? How does LAWs uniquely solve these kinds of things? We think that they process information on military operations extremely quicker than humans ever could, making sure that things get done quicker, ultimately saving the amount of time that people have to spend in these regions. That's how we're actually truly able to prevent this in the long term. But furthermore, we are happy to engage with the true comparative in today's debate. We gave you 3 key reasons as to why humans are always going to be a significantly worse actor in times of war. Fear. They told you that simply, no, they'll dissent. No, in my country, 18 years old is too young to be able to go out and drive a rental car or to have a drink, but ultimately it's old enough to be able to go out and determined to shoot Iraqis? No, we think that it's completely absurd to believe that suddenly people will be able to act rationally within very fearful circumstances. Secondly, in terms of self-preservation, people will always prioritize saving their own lives. LAWs have no need to save themselves because they're literally just like a piece of technology. But lastly, we tell you retributive rage. This happens through massive amounts of propaganda, messaging, how they're trained. They're literally trained to look at the other side as not human beings. That's where you actually see irrational decision-makings. That's where you see a decrease in mercy. Why do LAWs uniquely work better? We think that they have no emotions, simply what they're programmed to do within the confines of what standards have already been given to them. They autonomously act with the constraints that have already been given to them. But secondly, we think that there's massive amounts of accountability. Every LAW has a paper trail. They're always going to be able to see every single action that LAW has made. That means that you're going to be able to hold them accountable in the long term. At the highest ground, we say LAWs are risky and they don't act humane. We think that that's all the more reason to develop them further. Thank you.
This speech lasted 8 minutes and 32 seconds.
I would like to thank the third speaker of the opposition for their speech and would like to invite the reply speaker of the opposition to deliver their submission.
Side proposition in today's round did a decent job pointing out some technological limitations of LAWs and the fact that removing distance might marginally increase brutality. But they failed to engage on the comparative that we pushed down the bench about why humans are worse, especially when they're directly in these conflict zones, right in the thick of the action. We told you that the large majority of soldiers on battlefields are 18-year-olds like myself. Let's talk for a bit about what happens when you put an 18-year-old from Los Angeles on a battlefield. I'm an 18-year-old kid, I've been handed an AK-47 and told that Afghanis are terrorists and are barely human. I've watched enemy soldiers gun down my friends in front of me. I'm angry, I'm scared, there are bullets whizzing by my head, and I miss my mom. It is hard enough for me in this round to juggle all of the arguments that are going on. It would be exponentially harder for me as an 18-year-old on a battlefield to juggle bullets whizzing by my head and every single code of international humanitarian law that they expect humans to uphold on their side of the house. The comparative in this debate of LAWs that can be programmed to take all of this into account is far, far better. We're so proud to oppose. 2 questions in this speech. First, which side decreases atrocities? Second question, which side betters conflict? First on atrocities. Again, this was their argument about humaneness and distance. We've sufficiently proved that neither of these things really happens with humans. We tell you that LAWs that are created by an army of civilian programmers, in addition to civilian leaders and military leaders, are far more likely to be cool-headed when they're removed from the conflict and they're able to just program LAWs to operate strategically to perform missions to the best of their ability. They're not going to program LAWs to do things like rape or torture civilians at the point where that's really unstrategic. But even if the technology misses and fails on the battlefield despite extensive testing and does something bad, here's the difference. I can pull the plug on that LAW and take it off of the battlefield. When Soviet soldiers are massacring 350 civilians and disemboweling pregnant women, we can't pull the plug on them. We can with an LAW that is monitored by an officer. And we'd be happy to hold that officer accountable if they watch while an LAW commits all of these atrocities and stand by and do nothing. Furthermore, we can take that technology off the battlefield and reprogram it to make sure it never does that again. You can never do that with a human. On the point of decreasing atrocity alone, in a world where conflict to some degree is inevitable, we take the debate. But second, let's talk about which side decreases or betters conflict in both worlds. Their main argument here was that we decrease barriers to war. We had a lot of responses to this that didn't receive practically any engagement. We told you, governments already go to war for massively problematic geopolitical reasons like getting resources and things like that. But second, we told you in our third argument, it is the most vulnerable populations in these countries that are sent to war. Those who can't afford to pay the fee to escape the draft. Those with no other options. Those that governments explicitly target to pull them into war. Those with the least ability in society to stand up and say, hey, please don't send me to war. These are people that are disposable to the government. We think it is, first of all, wrong for the government to deploy them when they have another option. But second, it's unlikely that rich people in society are going to stand up for these individuals. But third and finally, third, we told you that protests of the Vietnam War weren't the sorts of things that ended it. And finally, the cases where we do go to war because we've reduced the threshold are things like humanitarian interventions. But they also told you that we're going to increasingly target civilians because some futuristic machine-on-machine exclusively war is going to happen. We told you in Layla's speech that for the foreseeable future, this technology, note, in a lot of cases, hasn't been developed yet. There are still going to be human soldiers on the battlefield. But second, we told you that if it is the case that these technologies are just being programmed to shoot down civilians, we obviously would not deploy them. We still believe in humanitarian standards. Third and finally, let's talk about civilian casualties in the Vietnam War, in World War I and II, and any other conflict. They are massive because soldiers, scared for their lives, don't care about civilians. We think it's far more likely on our side of the house that LAWs will. Very proud to oppose.
This speech lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds. I I would like to thank the reply speaker of the opposition for their speech, and would like to invite the reply speaker of the opposition to deliver their speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, Team Opposition have done a very fine job today. They've been such a good team, they've managed to argue Team Proposition's case as well. Because they didn't use our definition, but they didn't refute it as well. Now, first of all, these are autonomous machines, meaning you can't pull the plug on them. That was in our definitions. No human intervention. However, because we didn't enter into a definitional challenge, because they didn't challenge our definition, and because Team Proposition in the World Schools debating format has an exclusive right to introduce a definition, our definition stands. And they didn't use it, and they haven't been arguing by it. Now, let me get into the two major clash points of this debate, the two thematic clash points. Better conflict and the amount of conflict. Now, first of all, both teams agree that war is bad, and we must decrease the amount of war and the badness of war. Now, on the first clash point, the international relations clash point, which Team Opposition has made the main clash point, it's a question of technicalities, and we are unable to prove it to them unless we actually see this happening. However, because of the arguments we've raised, and I believe we have raised significant amount of doubt about whether these machines will actually be able to agree with these international rules, they haven't addressed those arguments. They only brought up the argument that humans are just as bad. But let us presume that they're correct. Taking opposition at their best still means that the amount of conflict is going to increase, which is our third argument, which they basically haven't addressed at all. Because they agreed in their first and second argument that because there would be LAWs, humans wouldn't have to be used, and therefore people would intervene more readily, for example, in humanitarian crises. And then, in their third speech, they said that human cost doesn't actually impact, and the human cost doesn't hold people back into going to conflict. First of all, that's a direct contradiction in terms, which completely undermines the first and second arguments of the first and second speaker. But even more importantly, it means that they agree with us and they concede that the actual likelihood of people going to war with LAWs now being dominant is significantly increased, because governments don't have to hold their people back. This means that our third argument, which means that the amount of conflict will increase, has the conclusion and the impact that even if conflict becomes a bit better or significantly better, if there are no impact of war, if people can go to war with the same kind of casuality as opening up their Xbox and playing a video game, then people will go to war. Because it is worth it, for economic reasons and for all other reasons. But as we already agreed with Team Opposition, war is horrible, and we must do everything we can to limit the amount of war we have and to increase to the maximum the humaneness of that war. So even if the humaneness is undecided, because the amount of war will increase, which they have conceded, I hold that our side of the house has shown that lethal autonomous weapons, killer robots, will only cause more conflict in the future, will not abide by international laws, and we are not able to hold them accountable, as proven by the self-learning machines, which they completely didn't understand. Now, I could go into how neural networks work, but I don't have time for that. Neural networks, you can't hold people accountable, and therefore, because we've won this debate on all accounts, and even on a fifth flashpoint, which didn't come up because they didn't address our distance argument either, no refutations on that, by the way, I hold that we have completely won this debate in the better conflict. But even if they have gotten that, the amount of conflict will increase, and therefore you must vote the proposition. Even if we can't stop war, we must make it more humane. Thank you very much.
This has lasted for I would like to thank all of the speakers of the debate. Please leave the classroom so the editors can make their decisions.